Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight at Venture Cafe for another virtual artist studio tour. As Kerway mentioned, my name is Angela McQuillan, and I'm the curator of the Esther Klein Gallery, which is part of the Science Center, which is also home to Venture Cafe. So today we'll be visiting the studio of Philadelphia-based artist Colleen Rudolph. Colleen is a multimedia artist specializing in sculpture and photography. She earned her undergraduate degree in fine art from Skidmore College and her graduate degree from PAFA, Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. She currently works out of her studio in Philadelphia, creating 2D and 3D portraits for private clients, designing and executing large-scale drawings and sculptures of wildlife, and employing fabrication techniques including woodworking and metalworking, as well as teaching sculpture. Her work is installed publicly throughout the region, and she's worked with several organizations to raise awareness and funding for wildlife conservation efforts. Now I'm gonna go ahead and hand it over to Colleen Rudolph. Welcome.
Oh, thanks, Angela. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming, and hopefully this is interesting. I put together a short presentation just to keep me on track and sort of give you some history of my work. So I'll go ahead and start that. Oops, sorry, I have to, oops. I just have to share the screen. So here we go, share. And now here's my, okay. So yeah, just bear with me for the little glitches periodically. So this first, oh, thanks. This first slide goes way back to 2008 when I did my final show at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. And I included it because I thought it had the elements that I'm still working with. But when I see this now, it feels very busy, and it's just an interesting kind of example of how your work can sort of evolve. Because looking back, I see the seeds, but at this point, I think I've been able to maybe clarify or simplify a little bit. But so I had, you know, these dancing feet and these marionettes and these machines that I made and the pigeons and the dogs. So that brings me to this, which feels like a relevant chain in my thoughts and thinking when making the work. And that is how humans kind of act as this pivot point between animals and machines. So of course I had drawings of dogs in the show, and then this is a video of the piano piece that you saw in there, which it's pretty low quality. Are you still able to hear me while the video is playing, or is it too loud? Okay.
We can actually hear you and not the video.
Oh, that's interesting. Hear it now?
I can't hear it.
Oh, weird. I guess it doesn't share your audio, maybe? That's curious.
Possibly.
Well, if anyone wants to see it, let me know. It's a little poorer quality video, but basically these motors turned these hands. Let's see if I can go back.
Are those bicycle wheels?
Yeah, so they're bike wheels, and then it's a little challenging to see in this low resolution image, but I actually cast both my hands out of resin, and they were on springs, and when the motors turned, you could actually go up and affect the speed of the motors, which then affected the sound that was generated by this the hands strumming the strings of the piano. And I was thinking about you know, music is this thing that humans make, and arguably some animals, I guess, I mean, that's a whole nother topic, but I was curious whether a machine could generate music, and the quality in music that we find ourselves responding to. I was thinking about whether a machine could generate that. So that was the sort of thinking behind that piece. And then these marionettes, this was another one where the viewer could come up and turn there was a crank just to the left here, and it would turn that bike wheel, and those little finger picks, I don't know if you can see them in the image, but they strummed the spokes of the bike wheel and created another little like dancing thing. So, I was experimenting a lot. I was working with steel. Can you see my cursor in here?
Yeah.
Okay. So I was working with steel and learning to use the forge. So I made this rib cage, and then using different materials to make the bones. And then I needed something light for the head. So that's actually, I'll show you the bust it's from, but it's actually just aluminum foil that I pressed onto the plaster bust that I had made, which, decrease the weight. So this is another piece that was thinking about machines, and I had read this article about the first robotic arm that they were actually able to integrate with our nervous system, and the one person who received this arm described cutting a steak and how they could feel that again. So I thought that was pretty magnificent, and this piece was inspired by that, and this center arm turned very slowly, so it was like a display. But yeah, looking back at this work, it feels, I feel attached to it or connected, but it feels a little scattered. All these ideas rush through my head, and I'm not sure that the work really arranged them in a cohesive way. But these are all parts of computer boards, circuit board, or I don't know if they're called circuit boards, but all the little pieces. A friend of mine wanted the, Mia, you remember Greg Scott, but he wanted the actual monitor casing. And so we went and found this recycling place, and we took a bunch of computers and used different parts. So now I bring the dog back because I wanted to talk a little bit, just briefly, about what happened after grad school, and this idea of making art to sell, and then making art that is because you just have to make it. And I think for me at least, there's been some tricky territory in terms of, after grad school, I did portraits, and I wound up selling some of them, and they were something that was marketable, and I was trying to make a living, and so I pursued that. And I mention it just because I think when you get money involved with art, it can heighten the stress about failure. Like if someone's paying you to do something, it's going to cost money if you make a mistake. So I think your risk taking is affected. And so that's just something I've been cognizant of as I make my work, like trying to keep space for work that is just my own, or something I need to explore and where I can fail, and then also trying to make work that potentially could sell. And so the portrait thing, I wound up doing a lot, and these are all just some examples, and they're on my website too now, and little sculptures. So I just wanted to talk about that, and if anyone has feelings or can relate, we can talk about that more. But so now this is a show where it was a solo show, which I really saw as an opportunity to again explore. And I don't know that my goals, although it's always nice to make a sale, I don't know, when I was making this work, I was just more pursuing the ideas and how the things related. And so again, you see the, you know, the animals are there. And this one I was thinking about communication and how we connect to other beings. And I think communication is a big part of that. So I, you know, had different illustrations of these moments of connection. And this was sort of another experiment where one person on the left can wear the elephant feet and they can move around, and they would step on these switches, and when the switch was depressed, it affected the pair of elephant feet on the other side of the room, and there was a motor in there, and it strummed this bass guitar string and generated this subtle vibration. And I was inspired by this, a book I had read that discussed that elephants actually communicate seismically, which makes sense because of their weight and their mass, like they're going to affect the ground. And I was really intrigued by that. Just all the different ways we can interact with others. And then interestingly, someone with this show talked about entertainment and what the difference, or if there's space for entertainment in art, and whether those should be separate or, so that was an interesting response that I, you know, started to think about after this show. Here's another, I set up 2 cups with the string. Those are actually the same hands that I used for the piano. So that's maybe a good thing to mention. I feel like I make these things and they sometimes travel with me into new pieces, or they're new iterations, using the same ingredients. This is back when Facebook was like still kind of new, or at least to me, and I was looking at all the different facial expressions and thinking about how you read emotion from just the face. And then this was like, I guess I was a little attempt at humor maybe, but I created all these IKEA instructions to understand the art. And I guess that was, I felt like sometimes people are hesitant, or it felt like, it felt antithetical to art to have instructions. But I do notice sometimes people don't have a way to access the art or discuss it. And so, I don't know,
I see your point with that, because as a curator, I feel like I try not to put too much information like on the piece so that people think about it for themselves. But it seems like for the most part, people prefer to have an explanation so they can know what to think about. So.
Yeah. And I think that's, you know, that's an interesting thing about us, is like, do we make our own worlds, or do we wait for someone to tell us how to be? You know, it can apply to a lot of things.
It probably depends on our personalities.
Yeah. But I think like this, maybe I was trying to make it a little light of it, because I thought those IKEA instructions are kind of funny if you ever look at the pictures, and they're sort of recognizable at this point. So I had a little fun with it. And this is one of the pieces in there where it was something called a drum bone, where you just lift up this one piece which extends the length of the PVC pipe. And so when the person is drumming, you can actually affect the pitch of the sound that they're making. So it's rhythmic and melodic. So I don't know, just a little fun with that. And then unfortunately, I guess you're not going to be able to hear the sound for this one, but it's another demonstration of how, you know, years pass and then I bring the marionette back out. This time I actually put some motors and had her moving by these discs that had the string attached. So I'll go ahead and play. And this was a collaboration. There's sound with this one, but you may, I don't know, I guess you won't hear it, but I'll just play the video. You'll see her moving. So with the sound, I feel like it's got this sort of darker feeling to it, but I was thinking about dance and similarly to making music, like how you dance, and if it's mechanized, does that change that it's dancing? You know, like again, I was just sort of thinking about that and what does it mean to dance? So again, here she is again, and this one she's not moving, but I arranged her a little differently. So it feels like they're kind of like a cast of characters sometimes that I keep bringing in. And this was at a show in Maryland, and I guess the human, I was bringing back more of the human form. And again, another sort of arrangement, thinking about our relationship to other beings. And then I threw this in because it's kind of a nice segue to this later work. This sculpture, I actually looked today to try to find the right pronunciation for this name. Do you know, does anybody know? I looked on I tried to find it, but I just didn't want to mispronounce it. But this statue is in the Wissahickon, and I remember when I first moved here, stumbling across this, and it's up high on the trail side where it's not like the big forbidden path. It's kind of tucked away, and for me that was really exciting to stumble across a piece like this. It's pretty large, and it's actually in 3 segments, I think is how they got it up there. But it was an exciting moment for me, and it is important because I think I really appreciate encountering art in the world and not just sort of in a gallery or museum space. And I think the environment and the art can really enhance the experience of encountering a piece of sculpture. So I brought that one in. There's a whole history about this piece and what it represents, which, you know, we could go into if anyone wants to talk about that later. But it was a piece for me that really, I love seeing that sculpture, you know, not thinking about what it necessarily represents, but the way it was sculpted and the engineering of getting it into that space, I think is really impressive. So then this actually is the piece that Angela, we worked together on. There was an opportunity at Little Berlin Fairgrounds to put some sculpture in, which is Little Berlin Fairgrounds, for those of you who don't know, was an empty lot that the gallery Little Berlin was given permission to use, and so they cleaned it up and installed. It was a lot of volunteer time to kind of make it a nice community gathering space, and it had art and people and music. It was a really nice moment.
It was a grant from the Knight Foundation to
Right.
make that happen.
Yeah. So so that was an exciting opportunity for me because it was a piece that I could put into an urban environment. And so I guess for me, I had a couple of goals for this. I had, you know, outside you have to deal with the elements, so it's limiting your materials in some way. So I've worked in bronze, but bronze is quite expensive. So concrete was something I had been casting, and I do like certain things about concrete. And so I decided to do this bear. And another exciting part for me was whether I could put this heavy concrete sculpture, have it just running on one leg. So, you know, the amount of weight being supported by this one leg that went, that made contact with the ground. So
Can I also just jump in? Is this the project where you needed a really deep hole dug?
Yeah.
And you had to bring in like some industrial machinery to do
yeah.
that?
So yeah, that, so with a lot of sculpture, I mean, because that's another thing, public sculpture, you have to think about safety, how the public's going to interact with it. And so there's a lot of considerations that tend to influence design. But yeah, so that's why I'm showing this armature, because I definitely overbuilt. This is the one leg that goes into the ground 3 feet. And I wanted to make sure that once I added concrete to all of this, that this one leg would be able to support the weight and wouldn't fall over and crush someone. So,
and also there was a lot of kids around, so they were
yeah,
catching on things too. So
yeah, and you just have to know that if you put something in a public space, like, you sort of let go of all control of it, you know. So so but it was interesting. I guess it was a challenge. I had never worked directly in concrete like this. So here I am on the lot. And so you can see now, here's the sculpture sort of mounted. We dug the hole that Angela mentioned with a backhoe. And I was lucky enough to know someone in the building industry who had a shop nearby, and he offered to come dig the hole. So that was really helpful. And because that's expensive machinery, not everyone just has that around. So we dug the hole and got it in there, and poured more concrete as a foot underground, and then backfilled the dirt. And then you can see sort of in these other images, I'm going around with this wire mesh material, and that gives something to for the concrete to bite onto, so I don't have to make it solid. And you know, working in these conditions, you wind up meeting neighbors, and it's an interesting shift, because normally the studio is a very private place, and when I was out here, there were a lot of people that would stop by and ask questions, and so that was a different way of working for me as well. And then this is the finished product, so, or the finished piece, I should say. And you know, I think it stayed in there, and actually I had to dig it up, which that's a whole nother story. But it stayed there for a while. I forget how many months, maybe like a year, I think it wound up.
It was almost 2 years, because we had to eventually get rid of it because the lot was sold to build condos. But it was there. It was there for a while, and it looked great.
Yeah, well, and it held up, which I was, you know, that was something I was pleased about, and it was all on that one paw. And then I did right before, so yeah, the lot was purchased, and everything had to get moved, and I wound up finding a home for it. But then right before I went to move it, do you remember this, Ange?
Oh yeah,
Somebody poured paint on it, and I included this because, like, I feel like I said before, you kind of relinquish control, and there was I had this whole discussion. It's like, well, do I leave the paint on there? Like, you know, is it part of the life of the piece now that it looks like this? But I eventually decided to spend some time to clean it up because the person that wanted it saw it before this. So that was interesting. And this is it at the sculpture gym where I did I guess, I cleaned off the paint, which took a while. And if anyone needs to know about enamel paint and concrete, I have experience with that.
So was it really difficult to remove because it was like, I guess at that point it was so heavy, right?
Oh yeah, so we did get, well, you can see here that we left a bit of the rebar. There's still a bit of this rebar sticking out, and we wound up just cutting it from the concrete foot that was in the ground. Mm-hmm. So, but yes, we used the same backhoe to lift it out and into my truck and then bring it to the sculpture gym. Yeah, but that's another thing. When you're working with massive things like this, you need a team. Like, I couldn't do this work without people, and there have been many who have like helped me lift it, like there's just, you just have to work as a team when you're doing this kind of thing, which I personally like. I think that that's a good, it's I mean, I've helped other people. Like, I think it's nice to work with other people, and the practice of art making can be pretty solitary, so I think having these moments where you come together to achieve a goal is a nice addition. And then I think I've maybe two more pieces to just share. This is another large scale sculpture that, and this picture is a little fuzzy, but here is a better one. Yeah, so this was cast bronze, and the way this piece came up was I applied to a show with just a drawing, and it was accepted. And in my proposal, I said bronze. And you know what? I actually think I did this before the bear, but because at the time when you're putting work outside, there's like, if it's going to be outside for a long time and it needs to stay, it's not of an ephemeral nature, then there's like a limited amount of materials that you can use. And so I proposed this piece in bronze, and then they accepted it, and I thought, okay, so then I talked to the foundry and got a quote, and it's expensive. Bronze is pretty labor intensive, and the casting costs alone are a lot. So I launched a Kickstarter and was able, I forget how many people contributed, but I was able to raise the money to cast. And so I did all the other work, like I did the mold making, because I had a relationship with the foundry, they accepted waxes that I made. And so I was able to save some money in that respect. So there was a wolf and a dog, and the wolf is probably 400 pounds, I think, and the dog is 160, but these are also hollow. They're not solid bronze. And actually I have another, this is a video of the wolf when it had just been welded together. And so these pieces where you see these seams are different pieces that get cast individually and then they get welded together. And so then there's the work of chasing the seams. And so that those rainbow colors you see are the heat of the welding equipment.
Can I ask why? I've never done bronze casting. I think it's amazing. Why do you create it in pieces like that?
So it has to do with the casting process. You're heating. I actually have a video on my website of the process for anyone who's curious, but basically you're limited by the foundry's capacity. So where I was, some foundries can cast much larger pieces, but what you have to worry about is the second the metal comes out of the furnace, it starts to cool. And if you have a lot of detail, cold metal, you know, you can imagine what I'm trying to think of, like candle wax. As it cools, it gets thicker. So when it's really hot, it's more liquid and it can flow into all those details very easily. As it cools, it can stop moving. And so if you have a very large piece, it can cause problems if you are pouring it and it's complicated, or there's a lot of reasons.
Mm-hmm.
but it's usually has to do with the capacity of the furnace and the casting area, and also handling the pieces. I mean, so I worked at a foundry, the same foundry that I worked with for this, and we were humans moving the molds. So if you get a really huge piece, then you also are talking about like a crane that's going to need to come in and move it. So it just depends on the foundry and what kind of equipment they have. But these were more manageable sized pieces that then get kind of fitted together like a puzzle and welded. But that's a good, or it makes me think about how there is some shifting that happens, you know, in that process. So, but bronze is a beautiful material, and I've experimented with different, like they make epoxies that you can add bronze powder to, and I just feel like there's nothing quite like metal when you get that surface.
I bet you can't get like any kind of a patina on the resin, right?
Well, yeah, the resins are tough because paint, or nothing likes to really bond with them.
Mm-hmm.
I've found, I think there's some, you could probably like some sort of etching solution that would give it more bite, but then like you're affecting your surface. But the epoxy I've tried to paint, like it's tricky because the paint just wants to scratch right off. And then you can tint your epoxies like as you're pouring them, but it still reads to me. Actually, I have an example. I was able to get some decent results, but it's just not that. I guess I'm like, well, it's just not the same, and I just don't need it to be the same, you know. It's just a different thing. But there's room for all of it, you know. I just personally like the way metal sort of sings. The luminescence, I feel like, is unique. And so then, oh, I showed that. Okay, so then I included, this was another show that I had. And again, I was thinking of these wildlife and experimenting with how I presented them. This was another sculpture in that show, which, so these heads were just like pressure fit by this rubber band, and this is sand, and so her face actually created a depression in here, but she could roll either forwards or backwards. So I was again experimenting. This is another of the series. There were about 6 of these that I did where it was just a creature alone in a landscape, in these frames surrounded by all these different creatures. And then this one was another small sculpture I did, and this is actually from an event with the it was public sculpture. They put on Rittenhouse Zoo event. I don't know if you ever went to those, but I was one of the sculpture. Oh, and Margarita was too. She's in the chat. But we sculpted live from animals that were brought to it. First year it was Rittenhouse Park. Second one was around Logan Circle. And so this came from that event. There was a turkey vulture, and they have bands around their feet. And so I was just, I guess, thinking about, what it means to be held captive. And but these are kind of how would I call them, like just improvisations or something with pieces. Like this head was done at a different time, and this was a different time. So it's like assembling, like taking all these things I make and putting them together in a way that has meaning. And then this is sort of something more recent, which is my last slide, and then I'll take you around or we can do questions or whatever. But this is a chimpanzee that I was inspired to make by a trip to a chimpanzee sanctuary that's in Florida. And they take chimps that have been in labs, or we're slowly phasing out the testing on chimpanzees, and chimps have a longer lifespan, so they need some place to go. So there's several of these sanctuaries where they go to kind of live out their days in a more free environment, with a more social environment where they're paired with other chimpanzees. And I was never that close to a chimpanzee, and I was struck by their expressions and how similar they feel to humans. And I was curious whether I could make a sculpture that functioned that way for me. So so this was one, or this is another larger piece. Yeah, so those are in the studio now, so I can share that. Oops.
I just had a question. I know that you've worked at the zoo and you were sculpting animals and you went to go see these chimpanzees, but when you're actually creating the sculpture itself, are you looking at photos, or like what kind of source material are you using, or working from sketches? How does that work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the wolf and dog sculpture, I had my own dogs. So for the dog, I was using live models, but also some images. It's usually like a sort of an array of source material that I kind of look for different things. If you have a live model, it's great because you can walk around them and you can get the different angles, but not all of these animals that I like to look at or make work about are available. The zoo is a resource where I've gone and studied movement, because that's why I say the wolf and dog, I wished I had gone and spent a little more time at the wolf. It's NewYorkWolf.org is where those pieces are now installed, and they have 3 wolves that are sort of like liaisons or ambassadors to the public, and the rest of the wolves on the property don't ever interact with humans because they're going to be released. So I wish I had gone and spent a little more time, because looking back at that piece now, I feel like there's certain things that are more dog like than wolf-like, and I think if I had spent a little bit more time, like I wouldn't have had that confusion. But it really comes from a variety of sources. It's never just one image. It's just, but the internet is a great resource because you can find almost every angle. Like sometimes I'll just Google like back hooves of a, well, I was working on a drawing of a Himalayan ibex, and it's like I just needed to see how their back foot sat. So the internet is a great resource, but there is no substitute for real life observation, because you just see the way things connect and the movements articulated, and I think that's really helpful, and a picture doesn't do that.
So we'd love to see your workspace. I just want to check in. Does anyone have any questions or comments for Colleen before we move on? All right.
Crickets.
Well,
okay.
Feel free to chime in whenever you want. We're at the conversational point of the presentation. So, oh, do we have something?
Oh, a hand. I don't know. How do you see that?
I don't have a question, but I just want to acknowledge the engineering in you, the visionary in you, and I've done public art too, and it takes a lot of research. You want to be able to sleep at night when you're working up, right? So overbuilding, digging deep, what temperature it is where you're digging and installing is really critical. How deep do you have to go? You have to go much deeper on the East Coast than you do in Seattle. Seattle is not as deep because it doesn't freeze as much. There's so many things that go into this stuff. Anyway, beautiful work. And there are many things that I've thought of. I can't remember them all as you've been speaking, Colleen. But
I know it's a lot.
Also, the research and your sourcing. It's like, because Colleen's a sculptor, so she's seeing things from all views, and gathering things from every view is so critical to get the spirit and the convincing elements that you're portraying of these creatures and these concepts. Yeah, and I love how the pieces, the elements are moving through pieces. As we evolve every day is our intention, that your sculpture is evolving too.
I hope so.
It's wonderful. Yeah. And working together as a team. It's very important. It's like the way we can move forward right now in this world.
Thank you, Margarita. So first of all, did you want to switch over screens? I know we're doing like a transition here.
Yeah, I'm just gonna switch to my phone, everyone, so I can walk with you. Okay. And the key is that I just have to mute my computer temporarily so we don't get that noise feedback. So let me go and just bring up the meeting here. I had it. And yeah, if there's a lot in the studio to look at, so if you see something, feel free to just stop me and ask about it.
So where's your studio located, first of all?
It is on American Street between Susquehanna and Diamond. And it's a good spot. I think I've had studios in different places, and this one feels really like a space where I can just expand. I worked out of my house for a while, and some of my family who's in the audience might remember how the house, it wasn't really I didn't have a living room because I was working in the living room, so I did that for a little while, and I feel like now I finally have that space to move and integrate things and not fight against myself as much. So I'm pretty grateful to be here. Okay, so here, join meeting, and there's video. Okay, so I'm gonna just mute this. Okay, now you should be able to hear me.
Yay, it's working. Good
Okay,
job.
good. Okay, so it's a little tricky because I can't do the turnaround thing with the lens, but so here I have the studio sort of divided into different areas. This is the cast. I've actually cast 2 of these chimpanzees now. So here, yeah, it's cast in plaster, and again, they are hollow. And my goal is to finally arrange them so they're facing each other. It's a little, I don't know if they're in the same frame, but you can kind of see this is the back and the front.
Yeah,
So
that's awesome.
my hope is to display them together, looking at each other. And then here, this is kind of interesting. This is the mold for the chimpanzee. So
Oh, wow.
here's the face. Can you see that?
So what is that, silicone?
This is urethane rubber. There,
Okay.
you can use silicone rubber as well. There's different considerations for when to use which one. But this, I did a poured rubber mold. There's also brush-on rubber molds that you can do. And then, so I have, this is like a head. I was trying to keep him a little wet. So I usually work with water-based clay. And so that means they dry out. So you have to like spritz them, keep them wet if you want to keep working them. So this is a head that, you know, we're talking about working from references. I've tried to do some work from my head. So with the human faces, because I think interesting things happen as I sculpt. Like you see these expressions, which kind of goes back to those, you know, that study I did of all the facial expressions. And so I enjoy that aspect, how you can like read emotion from an expression. Oh, and here's, before I forget, over here is the bust of the aluminum foil guy. So
Oh, wow.
that's what I had just put aluminum foil and kind of pressed it on. And that's how I got that one that I put on the marionette. And this was the other head that I did the same thing for.
Is that bronze or plaster?
Those are plaster.
Okay.
But I found this stuff, it's called Gilder's Paste Wax. And I like using it because it adds that luminosity I was talking about. So here's, I don't know if it may not translate in the video, but there's sort of a sheen that it gets. It's not like shiny, but it adds this kind of satiny finish that I like. So that was a fun discovery, that stuff.
So your studio is huge.
It's under, I think it's like 1,400 square feet.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I remember you telling me this a long time ago, but you bought this building and it was kind of like a raw space and you renovated it, correct?
Yeah, I actually have some pictures. It may be a little dark. Can you see that?
A little bit, yeah.
So that's, it's a little dusty too, but that is up here. And here's another, I have these pictures. I mean, the building itself was kind of like a sculpture, getting it to where I wanted it to be, where there was phases and kind of overwhelming at first, but it reminds me of how these big sculptures go, because if at the beginning you can't really think of all the work that's going to happen, because it's just like
overwhelming.
Yeah. So you kind of have to go step by step. But yeah, when I saw this place, it had been neglected and wasn't really being used. But the bones were good. So I don't know if many of you have experience with buildings, but certain materials rot, and if there's water damage, they can be a headache. But this one was mostly brick and concrete and steel. So those are very strong materials. So yeah, and I had been encouraged to, if I could, to find a place and buy ownership of it, because I have been in studios that you get kicked out because they sell it, and then all the time you put into making it functional, you then lose all that. So I had a professor that said to me, like, if you can, you should try to do that. But it was like a little scary, but I'm so happy. Like, it's like my sanctuary kind of.
Do you live close by, or is it somewhere you have to travel to?
Yeah, I was living pretty close by, but I just actually moved, but it's still pretty close. So that's nice. And then, yeah, so I have that, I don't know, I tend to get distracted, so.
No, it's good. Can you show us like a overview of your whole entire space? Because I feel like we're seeing like little corners, but
yeah.
Wow, that's impressive. How much space you have and how much you have going on in there.
There's a lot going on. I mean, a lot of my plants came in here just because I moved, and it is a little more crowded than, like, I have some house stuff in here now, but I do have sort of sections.
Colleen, what about your deck in the back?
Oh, well, yeah, that's a nice, I haven't really been, yeah, there's a nice space out. There's a driveway, and there's actually another artist that works downstairs, who, that's his entrance and exit. But it's nice, I thought about if I needed, I've worked out there before, so if I'm doing something really messy, or it's nice to have an outdoor spot. And then this is the shop area, and there's actually a sculpture I've been working on. I don't know, can you see it?
Yeah, it's a face.
So, yeah, it's hard because the screen is so little on my phone. It's hard for, oh, I just switched it. That's better, sorry. Okay, so yeah, this is actually a cast of my dad's head using alginate. I don't know if anyone has ever done life casting, but that's another material where you can, it's actually what they use to do your teeth. So you can apply it to your face and it won't hurt you. But this is an experiment. There's pieces of, there's other elements that I'm trying to incorporate, but that's not done. It's kind of just something I'm exploring. And then here's this is like my metalworking. This is all bronze here. So there's various levels of completion here. This one I'm mounting. This is concrete, this base, but I'll probably do it again. I've been thinking a lot about how to integrate nature, and maybe there's a way I can do it that's not so image specific. Mm-hmm. So I'm considering different things like that.
So we're actually coming up on 7:30.
We are.
Yeah. This has been a really amazing talk, and thank you so much for showing us your space. I just want to ask you, I mean, I know we're in the middle of a pandemic and there's no art shows happening right now, but what's next for you, and where can people find your work in the upcoming future?
That's a great question, Angela. I was supposed to have a show at the Fairmount House, but I think that those have, I'm not sure what they're doing, and it depends what the city's doing. But I will be showing some work in the Rittenhouse Fine Art Festival that happens in September.
Okay.
And if that still happens. So, but I'm hoping to figure something out with these chimpanzees and put something together, but we'll see how
That's great. Well,
Yeah.
I'm going to go ahead and put your website in the chat again. So everyone, please follow Colleen on her website.
Oh,
And
thank you.
yeah, and look out for her upcoming shows once everything reopens. And thank you so much for taking the time to do this today, Colleen.
Oh,
And
I
thank
feel
you,
like I
everyone.
talked for so long.
Oh, you did great. That's what you're supposed to do.
Okay.
Thanks,
Well,
everyone, for coming.
Thank you so much. Colleen, thanks for your big heart, your great work, and the donations that you make with your
Oh,
to benefit wildlife and animals.
thanks. It's so nice to see you guys. Oh, I'm just looking now. Wow.